tonight for our Wednesday night service, and looking forward to the time of praying and praising and the preaching of the Word as we're in the book of Ecclesiastes, and hope that you'll be with us tonight at 7 o'clock. I always enjoy the book of Daniel, and the first part of Daniel, of course, the first 6 chapters kind of give us indications of different events in Daniel's life and things that he went through, or things that God allowed him to be able to do with Nebuchadnezzar and in the situation he was in captivity, and how God took care of him. And it's no different today. We're in chapters 4 through 6 this morning, and in chapter 4 we're dealing with Nebuchadnezzar's dream, and this dream in particular is dealing with the dream that he is great, but then what ends up happening for a time of season, he runs around like a wild beast. And I'm amazed at Daniel's compassion for Nebuchadnezzar. Here is a wicked king, and a man I believe that Daniel has concern for and care for, and he is bothered by the interpretation. And Nebuchadnezzar, of course, this is Nebuchadnezzar telling the facts of what takes place. It's his narrative that Daniel has recorded down. And I'm amazed at Daniel's compassion for Nebuchadnezzar, and he pleads with him to do what's right, and to take care of the poor, and to do what he should do. And as I look at this, I see that in chapter 4 of Daniel, that Daniel really had this deep concern for him, and this is coming from the words of Nebuchadnezzar. So Nebuchadnezzar realizes the care that Daniel has for him, and I think that should be spoken of something that we can learn as we read this. We need to have a compassion for the lost, and we need to care for them, and we need to be faithful in doing what we're supposed to do, doing our job. Daniel was doing his job, and walk with God and have that relationship with God, so that then we can be everything that we possibly can be for those around us. Of course, Nebuchadnezzar changes his point of view after he goes through this, and at the end of chapter 4 you'll see Nebuchadnezzar's response and his attitude towards God, and how it changed, and he realized that who God was and the real God. Now, what I find interesting is you go straight from chapter 4 into chapter 5, and we see that Nebuchadnezzar is now passed off the scene, and his son is now ruling in his stead. And it's a very wicked situation. Belshazzar has a big feast, a big party, and he brings in the instruments from the temple, and he begins to abuse and to mock, and he drinks from them and worships gold, silver. And we find this his contribution to this part of the story in chapter 5. And then we see God's contribution. God always works. That's something you and I need to remember. And as you read this, hope you'll realize that God is watching and God sees. And then when you get to the next part of this chapter, Daniel is brought in because the king is scared half to death, and Daniel gives the interpretation, and he talks about things that he did with his father and how God worked in his father's heart, but Belshazzar doesn't have anything to do with that. And when Daniel gives the interpretation of the finger writing on the wall, it doesn't even move Belshazzar. He just goes back to what's doing. Of course, at the end of chapter 5, we realize that Darius comes in that night, in the same night that that party was going on. Darius, the king of the Medes and the Persians, come in, and he destroys Babylon. But Daniel is spared. It's amazing how God takes care of his people that are faithful to him, and sometimes God shows mercy and takes care of his people that aren't faithful to him. But in this case with Daniel, he's faithful. So as you read this, allow yourself to kind of absorb into the situation here. And of course, when we get to Daniel chapter 6 is a very famous chapter. Almost everybody seems to know this chapter, and it's Daniel and the lion's den. And we see here Daniel is promoted because he has the right spirit in him. boy, that's what I desire, is a right spirit. And that way when people see me, they see that there is a person that's genuinely concerned. And I think we should be challenged in that. But Daniel, despite the decree, despite the jealousy and the envy of these other men who are in control and don't like Daniel, don't like what he stands for, Daniel still does what's right. He still prays to God, just like he always has. And he gets thrown into the lion's den. And God spares him. God shuts the mouth of the lions. And of course, we know that the men that did this, they were thrown in the lion's den. They didn't even hit the ground. So look at this story and look at these things and allow them to speak to your heart. These first 6 chapters deal with situations in Daniel's life, with the leadership, with the visions, with his ability. First of all, he purposed in his heart. And then, as we've studied this, he stood when it was getting ready to be killed and said, let God work. And God showed him the original dream. And then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And then, of course, Daniel had to interpret a very difficult thing. Sometimes it's challenging to do what we think are difficult things, but we know they have to be done. And so that is that's a heavy burden on a heart. I sense that with Daniel in Daniel chapter 4, not wanting to tell King Nebuchadnezzar that what's going to happen to him. And we face those situations in our life. And so allow these 3 chapters to kind of speak to your heart and to help you. Of course, as we get into the rest of Daniel, we're going to see some prophecy and some things that are going to take place and that Daniel's going to be able to write down. Some things Daniel's not going to be able to tell us because the angel of the Lord won't allow him. Tells him to shut it up and to seal it and to not let people know. And so, but as you look at these different scenarios in Daniel's life, understand we all have scenarios. And how do we respond to them? So allow the Word of God to build your relationship with Him. Well, I hope you have a great rest of the day. Don't forget, I'd love to see you at church tonight. Be faithful to God's house, the gathering together. So I hope that you'll be there. We're looking forward to meeting and to doing. And I hope God blesses. Have a great rest of the day. And we'll see everybody tonight at